Hello, everyone. I see some folks have joined us already. We're just going to hang out here for another 2 or 3 minutes, wait for others to join, and we'll go ahead and get started. Thanks for joining us today. Thanks to everyone who's jumped on. We're just going to give it another minute or two, and we'll go ahead and get started. Thanks for joining us today. All right, we're going to give it one more minute. We'll go ahead and get started. Thanks everyone who's joined us so far. All right, we are at the top of the hour, so let's go ahead and get started. Thanks everyone for joining us today, and welcome to our June Detection Highlights webinar. We're going to be covering the latest detection innovations from VMRay Labs as hackers continue to evolve their techniques from abusing legitimate tools to bypassing modern security controls. Behavioral detection is more important than ever. With that, in today's session, we'll explore our new VMRay Threat Identifiers, including a four-signal Phishkit behavioral detection set, updated malware configuration extractors, and more than 30 new YARA rules that expand detection coverage across today's evolving threat landscape. Leading us through these updates today is going to be Patrick Staubmann. I think everyone is familiar with him that joins these calls frequently. He is the threat analysis team lead at VMRay, and he's going to explain what's new, why it matters, and how these detections can help you identify threats earlier and with greater confidence. So with that, let's get started. And Patrick, I'll turn it over to you.
Awesome. Thank you, Tucker, for that introduction. And also, hello, everybody from my side. Well, I think we will just directly dive into the content. There's plenty of stuff I want to show today, especially what we have worked on in the recent weeks. As Tucker already mentioned, the threat landscape is ever evolving, and we do see lots of changes, of course, that require updates that we ship on a weekly basis. So let's dive in. What is on our agenda for today? First of all, I want to quickly talk about some new threat identifiers that we have added throughout June. although one of them will actually be an update to an existing VTI already. Then we will specifically focus on new VTIs. In total, it's actually 4 that help us to identify Phishkit's behavior, specifically tied to evil proxy. And then finally, we have some new config extractors that we're going to take a look at. And also, I will share a bunch of new YARA rules, which we don't really take each by one because that's too much basically. But I will give a quick overview on what is new. And finally, I will walk you through one of the demo samples that we just recently looked into it, and that we also basically built some detections upon on that. With that being said, let's first quickly start with one of the VTIs we have recently updated to make it more efficient. And that's all about suspicious Office controls. So for all of you that are not aware with that, Office documents can have embedded controls that are sort of interactive objects, basically inside of Microsoft Office documents. And some of those examples could be like you could include buttons, you could include checkboxes, text boxes, scroll bars, or any similar control objects. And there are many different types, but from a security perspective and even from a malware perspective, for us, the most relevant ones are ActiveX controls and OLE objects. OLE stands for object linking and embedding, and that kind of allows you to embed other file types or other objects, external objects into an Office document. That could be a PDF document, that could be another Office document. And that's basically commonly used out there by threat actors to hide malicious payloads within legitimate looking Office documents. But it can also basically be used to exploit vulnerable controls that are part of those Office documents. And when you submit an Office document to VMRay platform, we do extract all of these controls from the file, and we identify them and try to associate whether one of these embedded controls is basically associated with a known vulnerability. That gives you a quick overview on whether there's something suspicious to expect within that file, even though they of course could be used for legitimate purpose as well. You definitely want to watch out and take a closer look into any Office documents that come with vulnerable controls. We do have already a VTI for that, which is classified under the category heuristics, but we made some improvements to that VTI, to the overall detection logic, and also to the description that VTI provides. So instead of you having to dive deeply into the analysis report to figure out where do we list those CVEs, where do we list the controls that we've extracted, we improved the description of the VTI. And when you drop down that menu here, we've dropped down that VTI here, you see immediately the description that we have extracted some objects here and that are associated with some known vulnerabilities in the past, giving you a faster way to identify whether this document might be interesting to further analyze and process. Next on the list is the new VTI, which focuses on the detection of an attempt to evade Windows Defender. I guess everyone is aware of Windows Defender, but what a lot of people don't really know is that Windows Defender also comes with its own emulator. So the emulator basically is used by Defender if you want to try to execute and start a file that Windows Defender doesn't really know. It usually throws it first in an emulator, quickly emulates the first couple of instructions within that file and tries to assess, to figure out whether saying, hey, well, this file might be malicious or maybe it's not malicious, depending on the behavior, on the context that the emulator basically sees. Those emulators, however, often come with very limited functionality. So an emulator is, you can't really compare an emulator with a sandbox. Sandbox, comes with the full environment. You can detonate everything. Everything runs natively somewhere in a virtual environment. The emulator, however, only implements the most relevant and most important functions that allows the emulator to, trace some instructions within that file. That also means automatically that emulators come with plenty of artifacts or plenty of weaknesses that can be used by malicious files and by threat actors to try and detect the emulator itself. And this is something that we have seen in Squid Loader. They have used an API call which is called NtIsProcessInJob. That's basically a low-level NT API call provided by the Windows API, which is in theory undocumented. So Microsoft doesn't really provide official documentation for that. And cyber criminals figured out that you can actually use this API call to identify whether the current execution is happening within a Windows Defender emulator or not. Depending on the context, so if it's running an emulator, you will get different return values compared to if you really run this either on a legitimate device or even on a sandbox. And that's basically what criminals used to avoid the detection of Windows Defender. Because if they say, hey, we are running in Windows Defender currently, we are going to hide our malicious activity, we terminate, we execute, we just don't do anything that would cause suspicion. Instead, if you run this on a real system or in a virtualized environment in a sandbox, then the check will actually pass. It looks like it's legitimate, it's not running in an emulator, and the malicious behavior will trigger. So given that behavior, we have introduced a new VTI under the category defense evasion that basically triggers for these checks if there is the attempt to detect the Windows Defender emulator via the specific technique that we have observed in QuickLoader. Then we have another new VTI under the category defense evasion, which is, by the way, one of my most favorite ones because I believe this is a really interesting and funny to analyze technique. And it's about detecting PowerShell execution from environment variables. I'm quite sure a majority of you are familiar with environment variables, but just to bring all of us on exactly the same page, environment variables are small named values or key value pairs that describe the current system or user's environment. As an example, you could use PowerShell to type $env colon username, which basically returns you the username within your current environment. We have recently looked into a sample or into a couple of samples that we haven't tracked and haven't seen before. We also haven't found any other references to these samples, so that's why we actually called it env-loader, given the fact that it uses environment variables. So instead of, executing PowerShell scripts or PowerShell commands directly, env-loader places PowerShell code directly in many, many, many different environment variables. So it's, like considering you have a PowerShell command that's maybe, a couple of hundreds of lines, they just split up that code into chunks and then placing each part of the chunk into a dedicated environment variable. And at runtime, when the sample tries to execute environment variable, the code is actually dynamically constructed again from the environment variable. And that kind of helps the malware to avoid static detection tools because they only always see a small portion of that script, of that code, but they never get the full context on what actually will be executed. To detect this behavior, we have also added, as mentioned, a new VTI, which I will also demonstrate a little bit later at the end of the webinar in a short demo run. Moving on to another new VTI, which is about heuristics. So we have recently observed an increase in web pages that try to impersonate well-known brands to hide suspicious file downloads. Just considering you will get an email, maybe that email points to a URL, and if you open that URL, you will end up on a page that might be branded like Adobe or DocuSign or whatever well-known vendor was out there. And instead of ending up on the real page, you basically end up on a fake page that has been created by criminals. And that fake page forces you or tries to trick you in downloading a suspicious file. In this case, we have observed this with a remote monitoring and management tools. RMN tools are basically completely legitimate software that is often used by IT teams to manage or to remotely manage computers, servers, and networks. The problem, although, is that we have seen an increase also in the use of RMM tools on the attacker side. They just use the same tools that our IT guys are using to get access, remote access to machines, to maintain persistence there, and to run any arbitrary commands on the systems. The problem here, although, is that knowing that RMM software is completely legitimate and used by administrators, it's often also more difficult to figure out whether there's an attack going on in your environment or not, because the traffic that could be in theory hidden or blended in just the normal IT operations that you would see in your environment. Which means that the most important thing here for us to understand and to think about is the context. So the context tells us that an RMM tool itself is not really malicious. But when it's delivered through suspicious download, through suspicious pages, or even maybe on a bigger picture, if a user receives an email, that email points to one of these pages that we don't really know, and then an RMM tool is downloaded and executed in the host system, that should definitely also raise your alerts and suspicion because that might indicate an ongoing attack. To better provide you the insights and to better provide you exactly this context, we have added a new VTI that specifically detects if there is branded pages that does not belong to the original page, basically. We will trigger that VTI if there is any files, specifically if there are any remote monitoring and management tools are getting downloaded. Moving on to the final part of the VTIs, which is all about detecting Phishkit behavior. So we have added in total 3 new meta VTIs, or 3 new, let's call it 3 new low scoring VTIs that all in all contribute to one specific detection of a phishing kit. First one of these VTIs is detecting Microsoft password reset pages. So given the fact that we have seen in quite a couple of phishing pages that attackers try to embed the legitimate and original password reset dialog into their own pages. For whatever reason, I guess most likely because it looks more legitimate in the end. So we've introduced a new VTI that tries to figure out whether there is an unknown page, an unknown web page, that embeds or manipulates with the original password reset node from Microsoft login page. With the password reset node, we just basically mean that there is either an iframe or anything else that looks like that page embedded into the malicious web page. That's the first part. For the second part, we try to detect line-broken login text. So this VTI specifically looks for text on the web pages that contains an unusual amount of line breaks together with login-related keywords. We have often seen that cyber criminals either are not really good in our languages, or on the other side, they maybe just want to intentionally add line breaks to avoid signature-based detections on web pages. So what we figured out is that when we look for these text blobs that contain these line breaks with login-related keywords, we do kind of get just another indicator that helps in the bigger picture, in the bigger context of detecting phishing pages. Because having line broken login text standalone in a web page is basically not enough. That actually can also happen in legitimate and real pages. But as mentioned, it's just giving us one more indicator to a bigger picture that helps us to evaluate and assess whether a web page might be malicious or not. And the third part we have here is the detection of connections to Microsoft related authentication services. So this VTI specifically checks if a web page or if a sample tries to communicate and connect with Microsoft authentication infrastructure. While this is also in itself completely legitimate because it's used by Microsoft services, it's used by browsers, all of the Office applications and Teams as well. It's just, again, another context that helps us to better understand the overall picture of a web page. Because the suspicious part here is that if we have an unknown sample or an unknown web page that is not associated to Microsoft at all, that maybe doesn't even have any legitimate use case, we can track this communication and we get a better understanding on what is happening during the web analysis. Looking at this here from a Phishkit point of view, this behavior usually indicates that there might be some credential harvesting going on, that there might be even multi-factor authentication bypasses happening because of token capture or even as a preparation for an account takeover. And that basically brings us to the new VTI that basically uses all of the three that I've mentioned before to get a bigger picture. And all of these specific techniques are something that we've observed in evil proxy phishing pages. So we want to use, or we're actually already using those three new VTIs. All of them are lower scoring, but we basically use all of these three VTIs to make our detection against evil proxy style phishing pages more reliable and more accurate for the future. Moving on to the config extractors, we have also recently added two new extractors. One of them is called RHClient2, or maybe someone you also know is at SectopRAT, which is basically a .NET-based remote access Trojan and info stealer. As we have seen an increase in the samples for this specific malware family, we have also taken a closer look into that and implemented a new malware configuration extractor to provide high quality IOCs for this malware family. And same applies for Gh0stRAT, which is, I think, quite interesting because Gh0stRAT is actually quite old. It was first observed in 2008, but it's actually still very popular and heavily being used in the threat landscape. And the reason for that is likely that the source code has been leaked or made public in the past, which means that we also see many, many different variants of that specific threat in the wild. And to also cover you with the most relevant IOCs for that family, we have implemented a configuration extractor for that as well. And finally, we have our YARA signatures. And well, in total, we have added again, I think Taka mentioned it, even more than 30 YARA signatures in the past month. And here is basically just a high level overview on what's the most relevant one and also what categories we basically have added. So you have again a huge list of spyware related YARA signatures. Some of them are detecting new families that we haven't seen before. Some of them are actually also updates to existing families. Same applies for loaders. Some are phishing pages. Maybe it's worth to mention that for phishing pages, we also improved our detection for click fix pages again, especially as we have seen an increase in click fix pages that only target macOS users. I think in the past we have mainly seen phishing click fix pages for Windows related systems, but it also seems that there is quite a big increase in click fix pages that try to target macOS users. And we have quite a big set of other rules here. Some of them are related to APT campaigns. Some of them are also related to recently observed exploits that we are going to cover with YARA signatures. With that being said, we have reached the end of the updates itself. And now I want to simply switch over to the demo part here. And if you remember, I have mentioned that we have added a new VTI for a very interesting technique, which is all about executing PowerShell commands from environment variables. And that's something I want to show in today's demo. So we're looking here into a dynamic analysis report from VMRay platform, which is just a sample. In that case, it's an MSI setup file that I've just submitted a couple of minutes before the webinar. We can see immediately here our system reports back that the sample is flagged as malicious. We see it's classified as a downloader. And we also see a threat name we have added with one of our recent YARA roles, which is called the endfloater. As you can probably imagine, the name endfloater comes actually from the fact that this sample is loading PowerShell script or executing PowerShell script from environment variables. If we scroll down, we do get an overview here of our VMRay Threat Identifiers that just try to, evaluate and trigger on behavior seen during the dynamic analysis. On top here, we have the most highest score, which is our YARA rule that immediately identified this as the endfloater on a couple of different artifacts, actually. We see here there's a YARA called endfloater VB script. We also see a YARA called endfloater batch script. And we can see some of them are triggering on our function strings, some of them triggering on dropped files. Given that fact, we basically know that this is endfloater. If you continue scrolling down here, there is the new VTI that I just talked before. So we have the defense evasion VTI saying it executes PowerShell commands from environment variables. And given the context, we also say that there seems to be Windows Explorer spawning a PowerShell process, and that PowerShell process then basically takes command line arguments, environment variables, and executes code from there. On top of that, we also introduced a fallback here, which is another YARA rule that also indicates that there seems to be PowerShell snippets or PowerShell code parts that are accessing environment variables for execution. So we also have that here. So all we know right now is that there seems to be at least process 23, which is the PowerShell process, seems to execute the environment variable. So we can just follow that anchor here and we can take a closer look into what is happening. So we will directly be navigated here to process 23. And process 23 shows us here the command line. And the command line says, well, it's PowerShell. Then they use the W switch within, which just means that that PowerShell window that's going to be executed by this process is supposed to stay hidden and it doesn't appear in the GUI. And then we see the command which uses IAX, which stands for invoke expression, and it references an environment variable called _setd. So if you're familiar with them, that definitely means that this environment variable _setd doesn't really exist on, clean or regular systems. It's definitely something that got added by threat actors. So that's basically everything we see. And even though we do not see more on the code that gets executed here, at the first look, we still capture all of the behavior that the PowerShell script or the PowerShell command causes. As we can see here, there's many file operations, there's even processes being opened, there is registry operations. We also see network traffic here to a specific domain and some IP addresses. We see the requests that have been made to that. So even though we don't really see the PowerShell command right now, we do get all of the behavior that is caused while the PowerShell script is executed. So now we may wonder, well, if there is an environment variable, where is it actually coming from? And if we scroll up, we can see that big process tree here. That process tree indicates how that whole execution of that specific sample looks like. To make this a little bit more readable, I will just go here into that table view. And all of this attack actually starts off with an MSI installer. The MSI installer uses a custom action, which at some point during the execution executes a Visual Basic script that was dropped as part of that installer. That Visual Basic script then executes another Visual Basic script, which then at a later point executes a batch script. So we see here quite a couple of execution stages with different scripting engines and scripting languages. Interestingly to see is that this batch script gets executed another time below here with an argument called /launched. So what is happening here, and this is quite confusing and also difficult to analyze if you want to do it statically. That's where sandboxes are coming into play here and really help getting faster results, is that this batch script actually gets executed via this Visual Basic script, but the batch script also references parts of the comments that are being added into this Visual Basic script. So they are both needed to have a successful execution, because the batch script also reads parts of the Visual Basic script. And that part here just prepares the environment, makes sure that everything is, set up correctly, that the script can be executed before it adds the parameter /launched, which then basically triggers off the actual execution. So if we take a closer look into process number 15, which is that cmd.exe that executes this batch script, we do see there is nearly 1,300 interactions with environment. And if we look here, the sample or this specific process tries to get environment strings. And if we scroll down quite a lot, because there's a lot of behavior happening, it also sets environment strings of that system. And we can see here, for example, if you remember that, I believe it was called setD. Yeah, it was setD. So there is also a API call that sets the environment string, which is called setD with a specific value, which in this case just points to a temporary folder location. To get a better understanding on what is happening here, and thanks to the low-level and detailed monitoring VMRay platform provides, we could simply look into the function log, which is basically our low-level log file that logs every single API request, every single API call that's being made during the analysis. And here you can also see if we just look for set environment variable, we do see 631 instances are being called during that analysis. And all of them are just setting a specific environment variable, like in this one here, underscore hat to see the exe. If you continue, there is something else being set, OCE to a specific value. That still doesn't really help now in reading what is actually being executed. So that's the reason why we just quickly wrote a parser. So we developed a small Python script that just parses that function log file, or in that case, we just pass the generic log, which is a little bit more detailed and structured because it's XML file. And we just try to extract for each of these calls to set environment variables, the name, the timestamp, and also the value that has been added. So what I can simply do is I could simply execute the parser on that glog file, and it tells me that that entry point variable is called setD. That's also the one that we have seen directly in the process tree before. And this one also references other variables. In that case, it's actually only 6, I think, or 7, but nothing more. So we have also already understood that there's even more environment variables being added that are being used, just used as obfuscation. And then we just write all of the data out into a new PowerShell script. So here we can see all of the environment variables that are being used with their content that has been set during the analysis. And if you scroll down all the way, that's basically then some of the final environment variable that basically is the entry point that executes all of the other one. You can see here it invokes expressions again with this environment variable joined with this one, and so on. And that's basically what we can get out of here. So now you may wonder, before we coming to an end here, that's actually quite, not simple to get because you need to, provide some scripts and you need to pass all of the stuff. There's also an easier way that provides you with access to these scripts and to the PowerShell commands that have been used. If we scroll down all the way to the final process that we have looked into before, that executes that PowerShell, that executes the environment variable PowerShell, basically, we can also just simply download the function strings that file or that process generates. And function strings is something that VMRay has implemented a couple of years ago, which basically gives you a good visibility into strings that has been extracted for API calls. Because at some point during that whole execution, strings that are being executed or strings that are being passed to Windows API functions, they have to be in plain text. So we can simply look into that file here. Now we see that function strings for that process. And if we scroll down all the way, oh, there we are. There is a big chunk again of a PowerShell script, which basically exactly represents what we've also seen before in the environment variables. So instead of having to pass all of that stuff, you can also always rely on the function strings to extract this data and this information. This, of course, is still not fully readable, but that's not part of today's webinar. That's basically just a static obfuscation that you could also have some scripts for and, de-obfuscate if you want to. But in most cases, it's not really necessary because we already anyways provide the most relevant information in our analysis report, and we also extract all of the IOCs that have been generated during this analysis, even though it's heavily obfuscated. And with that being said, we have reached the end of today's webinar, and I'd like to pass it back to Tucker. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Patrick. And thank you, everyone, for taking your time to join today. We're going to hang out here for a couple more minutes. So if you have any questions, feel free to drop them in the chat. If you don't, feel free to drop off. And we're looking forward to seeing you on the next one. So again, thanks for taking the time to join today. And we'll hang out for a couple minutes for any questions. Thank you.
Thank you.
All right, we will hang out for one more minute just in case anyone's typing out any last minute questions. But otherwise, feel free to drop off and thanks for joining today. Thanks everyone for the feedback. We really appreciate it. And again, thank you for taking the time to join today. We will go ahead and wrap up today's webinar and hope to see you on the next one. Thank you.
Thank you.